Hello, friends, and welcome back to another Halloween reading of The Invisible Man, Chapter 4. I have told the circumstances of the stranger's arrival in Impling with a certain fullness of detail in order that the curious impressions he created may be understood by the reader, but expecting two odd incidents, the circumstances of his stay until the extraordinary day of the club festival may be passed over but very curiously. There were a number of skirmishes with Mrs. Hall on matters of domestic discipline, but in every case until late in April, when the first signs of penury began, he overrode her by the easy expedient of an extra payment. Hall did not like him, and whenever he dared, he talked of the advisable of getting rid of him, but she showed his dislike chiefly by concealing it ostentatiously and avoiding his visitor as much as possible. "Wait till the summer," said Mrs. Hall sagely. "When the artists are beginning to come, then we'll see. And he may be a bit overbearing, but Bill's settle punctual is Bill's settle punctual, whatever you like to say." The stranger did not go to church, and indeed made no difference between Sunday and the irreligious days. Even in costume he worked, as Mrs. Hall thought, very fitfully. Some days he would come down early and be cautiously busy. On others he would rise late, place his room fretting audible for hours together, smoke, sleep in the armchair by the fire. Communication with the world beyond the village he had none. His temper continued very uncertain. For the most part his manner was that of a man suffering under almost unendurable provocation, and once or twice things were snapped, torn, crushed, and were broken in spasmodic gusts of violence. He seemed under a chronic irritation of great intensity. His habit of talking to himself in a low voice grew steadily upon him. But though Mrs. Hall listened cautiously, she could make neither head or tail of what she heard. He rarely went abroad by daylight, but at twilight he would go out muffled up enormously, whether the weather were cold or not, and he chose his loneliest paths in those most overshadowed by trees and banks. His goggling spectacles and ghastly bandaged face under the penthouse of his hat came with a disagreeable suddenness out of the darkness upon one or two home-going labourers, and Teddy Henfrey, tumbling out of the scarlet coat one night at 9:30, was scared shameful by the stranger's skull-like head. He was walking hat in hand, lit by the sunlight of the open door. Such children as saw him at nightfall dreamt of bogies, and it seemed doubtful whether he disliked boys more than disliked him, or the reverse. But there was certainly a vivid enough dislike on either side. It was inevitable that a person of so remarkable of appearance and bearing should form a frequent topic in such village as Impling. Opinion was greatly divided about his occupation. Mrs. Hall was sensitive on the point. When questioned, she explained very carefully that he was an experimental investigator, going gingerly over the syllables as one who dreads pitfalls. When asked what an experimental investigator was, she would say with a touch of superiority that most educated people knew that, and would then explain that he discovered things. Her visitor had an accident, she said, which temporarily discolored his face and hands, and being of a sensitive disposition, he was averse to any public notice of the fact. Out of her hearing there was a view largely entertained that he was a criminal trying to escape from justice by wrapping himself up so to conceal himself altogether from the eye of the police. The idea sprang out of the brain of Mr. Teddy Henbury. No crime of any magnitude, dating from the middle of the end of February, was known to have occurred. Elaborating in an imagination of Mr. Grood, the prohibition assistant in the national school, with his theory took the form of that the stranger was an anarchist in disguise, preparing explosives, and as he resolved to undertake such detective operations as at this time permitted. These coincided for the most part in looking very hard at the stranger, whenever they met, or in asking people who had seen him, who have never seen the stranger, leading questions about him. But he detected nothing. Another school of opinion followed Mr. Fairnside, and either accepted the piebald view of some modifications of it. For instance, Salis Durgang, who was head to assert that who was heard to assert that if he chose to show endless as fair, he'd make his fortune in no time, and began a bit of a theologian compared the stranger to the man with the one talent. Yet another view explained the entire matter by regarding the stranger as a harmless lunatic that had the advantage of accounting for everything straight away. Between these main groups, there were whatever and comprehensible Sussex folk have few suspicions, and it was only after the events of early April that the thought of the supernatural was first whispered in the village. Even then, it was only credited among the women folks. But whatever they thought of him, people in Impling on the whole agree in disliking him. His irritably, though it might have been comprehensible to an urban brain worker. He was an amazing thing to see. He was an amazing thing to see. Quiet Sussex villager, the frantic gesticles they surprised now and then, the headlong pace after nightfall that swept upon him, them around quiet corners, and inhuman bludgeoning of all the tentative advances of curiosity. The taste for twilight that led to the closing door and pulling down the blinds, the extinction of candles and lamps. Who could agree with such going on? They drew aside as he passed down the village, and when he had gone by, young humorists would up with coat collars and down with hat brims, and go pacing nervously after him in imitation of his occult bearings. There was a song popular in that time called "The Bogey Man." Miss Statchell sang it at the schoolroom concert in aid of the church lamps. And thereafter, whatever one of the two, the villagers were gathered together, and the stranger appeared. A bar or so of this tune, more or less sharp or flat, was whistled in the midst of them. Also belated little children who called Bogeyman after him, and make off tremendously elated. Cuss, the general practitioner, was devoured by curiosity. The bandages excited his professional interests. The report of the thousands and one bottled aroused and his jealous regard. Although April and May he converted an opportunity of taking the stranger, and at last towards Wistside he could stand it no longer, and hit upon the subscription list for a village nurse as an excuse. He was surprised to find that Mr. Hall did not know his guest name. He give a name, said Mrs. Hall, an assertion which was quite unfounded. But I didn't rightly hear it, she thought. It seemed so silly not to know the man's name. Cuss rapped at the parlor door and entered. There was a fairly audible, imperceptible in precaution from within. "Pardon my intrusion," said Cuss, and then the door closed and cut Mrs. Hall off from the rest of the conversation. She could hear the murmur of voices for the next 10 minutes. Then a cry of surprise, a stirring of feet, a chair flung aside, a bark of laughter, quick steps to the door. Cuss appeared, his face white, his eyes staring over his shoulder. He left the door open behind him and, without looking at her, strode across the hall and went down the steps, and she heard his feet hurrying along the road. He carried his hat in his hands. She stood behind him, looking at the open door of the parlor. Then she heard the stranger laughing quietly, and then his footsteps came across the room. She could not see his face where she stood. The parlor door slammed, and the place was silent again. Cuss went straight up the village to Bunting the vicar. "Am I mad?" Cuss began abruptly as he entered the shabby little study. "Do I look like an insane person?" "What happened?" said the vicar, putting the annual mite on the loose sheets of his forthcoming ceremony. "That chap at the inn." "Well, give me something to drink," said Cuss, and he sat down. When his nerves had been steadied by a glass of cheap sherry, the only drink the good vicar had available, he told them of the interview he had just had. Went in, he gasped, and began to demand a subscription for the nurse fund. He'd struck his hand in his pocket, and as I came in, and he sat down lumpily in his chair, sniffed. I told him I heard that he took an interesting in scientific things. He said yes. Sniffed again, kept on sniffing all the time. Evidently recently caught an infernal cold. No wonder, wrapped up like that. I developed the nurse idea, and all the while kept my eyes open. Bottles, chemicals everywhere, balance, test tubes and stands, and a smell of everything primrose. Would he subscribe? She said he'd consider it. Asked him point blank what he was researching. Said he was a long research. Got quite cross. A damnable long research, said he, blowing the cork out so to speak. "Oh," said I, and out came the grievance. The man was just on the boil. Now my question boiled him over. He had begun giving a prescription, most valuable prescription. What for he wouldn't say. Was it medical? Damn you! What are you fishing after? I apologized, dignified, sniff and cough. He resumed. He'd read it, 5 ingredients, put it down, turned his head, dropped for air for window, lift the paper, swish rustle. He was working in a room with an open fireplace. He saw a flicker, and there was the perception burning and lifting chimneyward, rushing towards it just as it whisked up chimney. So just at the point to illustrate his story, out came his arm. Well, no hand, just an empty sleeve. Lord, I thought that was a deformity. Got a cork arm, I suppose, and was taking it off. Then I thought there was something odd in that. What the devil keeps the sleeve up in the open if there's nothing in it? There was nothing in it, I tell you. Nothing down it, right down to the joint. I could see right down to the elbow, and there was a glimmer of light shining through a tear of the cloth. Good God, I said. Then he stopped, stared at me with those black goggles of his, and then at his sleeve. Well, that's all. He never said a word, just glared and put his sleeve back in his pocket quickly. "I was saying," said he, "that there was the prescription burning, wasn't I?" Intercognitive cough. "How the devil," said I, "can you move an empty sleeve like that?" "Empty sleeve?" "Yes," said I, "an empty sleeve. It's an empty sleeve, is it? You saw it was an empty sleeve." He stood up right away. I stood up too. He came towards me in 3 very slow steps and stood quite close. sniffed venomously. I didn't flinch though. I'm hanged if the bandages knob on his hand, and those blinkers aren't enough to unnerve anyone coming quietly up to you. You said it was an empty sleeve, he said. Certainly, I said it. At staring and saying nothing, a barefaced man, unspectacled, stares scratched, then very quietly pulls a sleeve out of his pocket again and raised his arm towards me as though he would show it to me again. He did it very, very slowly. I looked at it, seemed an age. Well, said I, cleared my throat. There is nothing in it. I had to say something. I was beginning to feel frightened. I could only see right down it. He extended it straight towards me, slowly, slowly, just like that, until the cuff was 6 inches from my face. Queer, queer things to see an empty sleeve come at you like that. And then, well, something exactly like a finger and thumb. It felt nipped my nose. Bunting began to laugh. There wasn't anything there, said Cuss, his voice running up into a shriek at the there. It's all very well for you to laugh, but I tell you, I was so startled I hit his cuff hard and turned around and cut out of the room. I left him, cussed up. There was no mistaking the sincerity of his panic. He turned around in a helpless way and took a second glass of the excelled Vixen, very inferior sherry. Well, I hit his cuff, said Cuss. I tell you, it felt exactly like hitting an arm. And there wasn't an arm. There was a ghost of an arm. Mr. Bunton thought it over. He looked suspiciously at Cuss. It's a most remarkable story, he said. He looked very wise and grave indeed. It's really, said Mr. Bunting, his judicial emphasis, a most remarkable story. And that's the end of chapter 4. So, friends, thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Follow us on social media, funkyplaybrothers and funkyplaybrothers. And please remember to help us by subscribing to our YouTube. Thank you for watching. Bye.